more broadly. So yeah, I'll go ahead and kick it off there. So I'm going to start out with an overview of acoustic monitoring as a methodology. And so with this methodology, I think about it in the context of the recent expansion of non-invasive methods that we use to study wildlife. And these methods have really taken off in the past several decades. For instance, there's eDNA, drone surveys, and camera traps. And all of these methods don't interact directly with the animals, so they can reduce injury or stress to wildlife, as well as the habitats and areas that they're living. And one of the really cool parts about this is that we're still learning all of the different uses and ways these methods can be applied, as well as how to analyze it. So acoustic monitoring is basically studying wildlife in the areas in which they live using audible signals. So anything that makes a sound, you can study with this method. And there are two ways to do it. The first is passive and the second is active. Active basically just means anytime that you're out there physically while you're taking audio. But what I'll be talking about here, the context I'm framing this is passive monitoring, which is where you're not physically there with the monitor. You generally just set it out for a longer period of time and let it do its thing. And this is done using ARUs, which are monitors that can be set out for long periods of time without having a human present. So going into the pros and the cons of this methodology, some of the pros are that you can gather really large amounts of data. If you have a monitor that's out there for days, weeks, or even months at a time, you can gather a lot of data. And this also means that it's flexible in the way that you analyze that data. So if you collect data during the dawn chorus where a lot of birds are singing, you can not only analyze that for the target species, but you can also go back and analyze that in the future for a different species that also calls during the same time period. So it's pretty cool. Once you have those audio files and that audio data, you can apply it in a lot of different contexts. And you can also study a wide range of taxa, anything that calls. So it's been used for whales, frogs and toads, bats, even katydids, and of course birds, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. You can also use it in citizen science. Once these monitors are set up and ready to go, you don't need a super specialized personnel to go out and put them out into the field, which I think is really cool because it expands the reach of the people that are able to go out and, get their hands dirty and see hands-on how fieldwork works and how science works. It can also solve some issues whenever animals avoid humans. With cuckoos, that's obviously a big factor. And it also expands the spatial and temporal coverage of the monitoring effort. Some of the cons of this methodology is that with gathering large amounts of data, you have to have somewhere to put all of that data. So yeah, you need a large amount of storage space in order to back up and store all of that data. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. It's also pretty intensive in the time that it takes to process that audio data once you have it from the field, and I'll also touch on that later. Lastly, just like with any monitoring method, we don't exactly know what a zero means. A zero could mean that the animal wasn't present at the site, or it could mean that it was present and we just didn't pick it up. So in this case, that would mean if a cuckoo is at a site but just never called while it was there, we wouldn't have any way to see that. So there's a lot of different ways in which this has been used, some of them being presence absence, site occupancy, and phenology. For instance, with monitoring spotted owls, you can tell the differences in calls between male and female owls. And if you have multiple male and female calls on several nights in a row, you can be pretty confident that there's a breeding pair there, which is pretty cool. You can also get a daily and seasonal periods where animals are active. So in this case, if you were looking to see when bats emerge after the winter, you can also look at social behavior in the way that animals communicate to each other. So for instance, they put monitors actually into rivers and found that river dolphins have this huge, really broad range of signals that they use to talk to each other, which is pretty cool. The use cases of this are a little bit more limited, but you can also look at abundance and density, such as with the bell miners that I have up on the top right. And lastly, you can look at habitat use, which is one of the ways that I'll be talking about today. To give you a sense of how this methodology has changed over the years, back in the 1970s, we had monitors that were really big and really bulky. They had to be carried around in basically a giant briefcase, and you had to be physically there to turn it on and off. And it's limited how much data it can store. It's limited by the roll of film that's on there, which isn't a whole lot. Luckily, nowadays we have things like the audio moth, which is a lot smaller, a lot more easier to move around. It can fit in the palm of your hand, and it weighs about as much as your cell phone. So it's been pretty cool to see how this field has changed, and really these changes have really allowed it to be used in a lot of different scopes. And one of those scopes that I'll be talking about today is in the state of Montana, where we apply audio monitoring to look at cuckoos. And when I say cuckoos, in this state, we have both the eastern and the western yellow-billed cuckoo, as well as the black-billed cuckoo. And here I mentioned earlier that my project is mostly focused on black-billed cuckoos, but we would love to apply it for yellow-billed cuckoos also. It's just a matter of yellow-billed cuckoos are very, very rare here. So it's really going to rely on how much data we're able to gather on them, how many times we're able to actually pick them up to see if we can analyze that data. So we'll see. So I know all of you know a lot about yellow-billed cuckoo, but just in case you're not as familiar with its cousin here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the black-billed cuckoo. So this cuckoo is mostly found in the northeastern US and southeastern Canada for its breeding range, and it winters down in northwestern South America. Just like yellow-billed cuckoos, these guys really like to feed on insects, and caterpillars are a favorite diet item for them. Even more so than the yellow-billed cuckoos, they really like to specialize on caterpillars, and particularly the ones that are toxic and hairy, which I think is pretty cool. They're one of the only species that can really eat these bugs. And then also, like the yellow-billed cuckoos, they will parasitize other nests, but not always, only in certain cases. So in this state, they're listed as a species of greatest conservation need and greatest inventory need. And greatest inventory need really just means that we don't have a lot of data on them. We don't really know what the trends look like, and we need to do more monitoring to gather a better picture of what their numbers are like in the state. And then species of greatest conservation need obviously means that their numbers we're pretty confident are going down to the point that we need to step in and take some kind of conservation action there. And Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is developing a statewide monitoring plan in the next couple of years. So we're really focused on doing the groundwork to move that forward. So starting in 2012, they began to monitor for both yellow-billed and black-billed cuckoos in the state using the yellow-billed cuckoo playback surveys, which is where you go out and visit a site, and do broadcast of cuckoo calls and then wait to see if any call back or fly up. They quickly realized that there were several challenges with this state, namely that black-billed and yellow-billed cuckoos are very rare here, and they inhabit really remote areas, some of which you can only access by river. So it's very, very hard to get out to where they're at. And then also to do these playback surveys, you need highly trained personnel. And these different factors combined means that it's really difficult to get those 2+ surveys per breeding season that you really need for those playback surveys. So this leads me to my first research question, which is, are ARUs a more efficient way to gather high quality data for cuckoos in the state versus in-person playback surveys? So really focused on looking at these two methodologies side by side to see which method is getting us, bigger bang for our buck and getting us high quality data without having to put a lot of time and a lot of money into monitoring efforts. So a little bit of background information. Playback surveys improve detection of cuckoos over passive point count surveys. Johnson and Benson's study found that for black-billed cuckoos, when they did a 6-minute playback versus a 5-minute passive point count, they were up to 12 times as likely to pick up cuckoos if they were present at a site. So it's pretty big increase there. With ARU surveys and point counts, it's a little bit more gray. Generally, the research has found that each method selects for different species, and that one might be more effective than other in a different context based on what your research questions are. And so we're not really sure how ARUs compare to playback surveys yet. Again, since use of ARUs and audio monitoring has really grown in the past several years, we're still looking at all the different cases in which they can be used and whether or not they perform better or worse than other methodologies. And so for this first question of my project, we're not looking to compare playbacks versus ARUs like everywhere in every context, but we're really looking at it for a rare species being cuckoos in remote areas with some limitations on the time, personnel, and budget that we're able to put into monitoring efforts. So moving on to my second research question, I'm interested in looking into what habitat variables are associated with black-billed cuckoo occupancy at the edge of the species breeding range. And black-billed cuckoo habitat use is really deficient for data. There are some studies that have been done from the central portion of their range, but we're not really sure how much they apply to the semi-arid Great Plains region that we're working in here. We're not sure if they're selecting for the same habitat or if they're using, totally different areas. And just to show you kind of the scope of our knowledge on black-billed cuckoo habitat use, there's been studies done in South Dakota, Ontario, Quebec, Illinois, and in the Great Lakes region. But all of these are pretty different ecosystem and pretty different habitats that we're looking at in the central and eastern part of Montana. And so looking at black-billed cuckoo conservation, this species is what was labeled as a tipping point species in the State of the Birds document that was released in 2022. And the idea of these tipping point species are birds that could be the next to face endangered or threatened species status. So species that have lost more than two-thirds of their populations in the past 50 years. And black-billed cuckoos are one of these species. From 1970 to 2014, their numbers went down by 68%, so pretty big drop off there. And I think this is a really good case for proactive conservation where, stepping in now and improving monitoring and conservation efforts can make a really big difference with this species and keep it from getting to a threatened or endangered status. And so the kind of driving factor behind this second research question is that the sites that we select to survey in Montana currently are based off of habitat selection for the western yellow-billed cuckoo. And we don't really know how well that applies to what black-billed cuckoos are using, but we also don't have the research on black-billed cuckoo habitat use to really know what we would think they would select for in these areas. So we're really just trying to fill this gap here. And to summarize my questions, the first one is testing out using ARUs for population monitoring in the state rather than playback surveys. And the second one is looking at black-billed cuckoo habitat relationships on the edge of their range to make sure that we're looking in the right places for these birds. So talking about the surveys that we're going to be doing and that we have been doing, the Montana Natural Heritage Program did habitat suitability modeling for both the yellow-billed cuckoo and the black-billed cuckoo. This is great because it gives us an idea of, on a really broad scale, what regions are cuckoos using and where should we start off for the scope of this project. And so you can see in the yellow-billed cuckoo model, the portions that are west of the Rocky Mountains are going to be a western yellow-billed cuckoos, and the ones east of the Rocky Mountains are all eastern yellow-billed cuckoos. And then you see that the black-billed cuckoo really is only found in the eastern and central parts of the state. They're really not found west of the Rocky Mountains. So this gives us a broad scale idea of the fact that they're living and using these large river valleys. So the river valley that you see highlighted in red to the north is the Missouri River, and then one that's farther south that's in the black-billed cuckoo and the yellow-billed cuckoo map is the Yellowstone River Valley. And that's really the scope of our project, is we're looking in the Great Plains region within these river valleys. And so in these regions, we're looking at survey points across 3 different rivers, the Missouri to the north, the Mussel Shell in the middle, and the Yellowstone to the south. At each point, we're doing a playback survey and putting out an ARU for the whole breeding season. And some of our collaborators in this project are Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, the Bird Ecology Lab, and Montana Audubon. So we're all working to survey these different points. Surveys started in 2021, and they'll keep going into 2023. So at each of these points, we're also looking at habitat. So we're going to be gathering veg surveys to kind of ground truth, remote sensing, and LiDAR data, just to get a sense of what does that habitat look like on the ground, so that we can look into what cuckoos are selecting for. So as I mentioned, we'll be putting ARUs at each point, and I figured that I would talk a little bit about what this methodology looks like, actually putting it into practice here. So there's a range of different models of ARUs and a range of different costs for them. It can range from the cheapest one, which is the Audio Moth at about $90, to the more pricier ones, such as SM4 and Chorus, that are about $500. And the differences between these monitors are really in the audio quality and the different ways that you can program them. So as you can see, the higher range ones have a external mic, and some of them have a dual microphone. And that provides better audio quality, but it does run a little bit of a higher risk of getting damaged. And for Cuckoo work, generally the single internal microphone is enough to gather a high enough quality data that we can analyze and get all the data that we need to from it. Another thing to mention is that some of these come with cases. Actually, I think all of them come with cases. And these really allow it to survive the weather that it gets hit by out in the field a little bit better, rain and storms and all of that. But they can increase the directionality of the audio that you're getting. So they kind of funnel the sound. So it's mostly coming from one direction. And the Audio Moth case that it comes with, which is the center image here, can actually cancel out the lower frequency calls, which is where cuckoos are generally calling. So for our monitoring, we use a case for the song meters, which is the picture on the bottom left. And then we also use Audio Moths, but we just put them into a baggie so that we don't cancel out those lower frequency calls. Those are the two that we use. And then I've also put in a picture of the SM4 on the bottom right, just to give you an idea of what these different monitoring methods and setups can look like. So then before you set them out in the field, you have to set them up. With the Audio Moth, you plug that in and load it into a desktop app where you set the sampling rate in different settings, such as the gain, as well as when you want it to turn on. So we sample for 4 audio periods during the day. And then for the song meter, you program it using a phone app, which I don't have pictured here. But I think that the cool thing about that is that you can change it once you're out into the field. So it's a little bit more flexible in that you don't need to have a desktop there and plug it in to set it up. It's a little bit more portable with that, but they are a little bit of a higher range monitor. So then whenever you're putting them out in the field, there's 2 big things to think about as far as placement. One is, how is that sound getting attenuated in the area? And that just means, how is it scattering as it hits, leaves and trees and other things out in nature that can scatter sound waves. And generally the rule of thumb for that is that soundscape is going to correlate to your viewscape. So if something is blocking your view, it's probably also blocking the sound. So you want to avoid putting it in areas that are really dense, that will not pick up as many cuckoo calls. You want it to have it in a fairly clear area. This can be pretty hard with cuckoos because obviously they favor really dense areas, or at least that's the protocol that we've been using so far. And so we generally try to just put them, if there's a clear area within a dense thicket, or if we can put them above a lower vegetation layer, then we try to do that. And then the other thing to think about is sonic masking, which is basically just other sounds that cover up the signal that you're trying to monitor for. And this can change over time, right? If you have your cuckoo calling while a train is going by, then you're obviously only going to pick up those train sounds. You're not going to pick up the bird calling. And so another thing to think about is, with rainy seasons, will washes fill up? Will that sound of running water cover up things? But this can also be busy roads, windy ridges, anything that's going to have another source of sound to mask that signal that you're trying to catch. So then after you've gotten that data from the field, there's 3 ways to analyze it. The first one, which is manual verification. This one needs the least amount of specialized software or knowledge, but it's also the one that takes the most amount of time. And you do have to do a little bit of manually verifying your data in all 3 of these methods, but the first one is if you're just going through and looking at all of the data. The second, if you're using some sort of specialized software to classify calls. And this, you need a little bit more specialized software and knowledge of how to use that, but it can really save you a lot of time. And then the third one here is machine learning, which performs the best on picking up calls of interest out of all of the background noise, but you do need the most amount of specialized skills and knowledge to use these. And I'll kind of walk through what each one of these actually looks like. So after you've gotten the sounds that you're trying to look at and you take those into audio files using either AudioMoth or SongMeter or some other monitor. You convert that sound into an image that's called a spectrogram, where frequency is on the y-axis, time is on the x-axis, and color corresponds to how loud a sound is, like what's the power of the sound. And you can manually verify it at this step. So this is good to do if you're just getting started or kind of getting to know the data and the different calls that you have in your area, or if you don't have very many sites. You know, if you only have a handful of sites, you can go through and manually look at the data for just a couple of days without too much time. But very quickly, actually looking through the spectrograms for all of this audio takes up a lot of time. And the way that we get around that is using classifiers. This is the second way to analyze that I mentioned. And the purpose of the classifier is to trim down the amount of audio that you have to look at. And they perform in different ways. I'm going to highlight two here, one of which is Raven Pro and the other is Kaleidoscope Pro. There's other softwares out there, but these are two of the most commonly used ones. And the way that Raven works is you put the spectrogram into it, and it picks out signals within a certain frequency band based on parameters that you give it. Kaleidoscope looks at the spectrogram and clusters signals into similar categories of sound. So each of these gives you a subset of data that you then manually verify without having to go through your whole data set. And the third method that I mentioned to you is machine learning, which is instead of using a pre-made classifier software, you use some kind of machine learning model that's been specially trained. And to kind of briefly explain how this works is you take spectrograms and put them into a you give it to a model that it's created based off of files that you've given it that either do have cuckoos or don't have cuckoos. And you tell it which ones have the signal that you're looking for and which ones don't. And that allows it to process the new data that you give it and
Looks like we lost Anna. I'm going to see what happened there.
Hi here, sorry about that.
Hi, no worries. I was just realizing I didn't have your phone number and I couldn't check in with you.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, let's start
Yeah, I
again.
guess we must have had a little Wi-Fi blip there. We have a storm
Yeah.
today, so. All right, hopefully that doesn't happen again. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, it looks good. Thanks,
All right.
Anna.
Perfect. Yeah, so I'll just pick up where I left off here. So yeah, so the machine learning model gives you a confidence score output for each file. And then you take that and put it through this post-processing stage where you sort that by sites and then pull out the highest scoring file either for each day or whatever parameter you're trying to look at. And then you go through and manually verify those clips for the presence or absence of cuckoos. And that just helps to make sure that you have no false positives in your data. So to give you an idea of how much more efficient this makes our data processing, if I was to manually verify the initial audio files from one season of our data, I would have about 7,560 hours to go through. Once we put it through the machine learning model, I only have 10 and a half hours of audio to manually vet. So it's massively more efficient and saves us a lot of time by using these classifier models. And in this post-processing step, the way that you do that is really informed by the questions that you're trying to answer. So if you're just looking for presence at a site during the breeding season, you could just look whether or not there was one cuckoo call that was heard during the breeding season. However, if you're looking for how long the site had cuckoos present at, or maybe at site turnover, you could look at the daily scale, which would give you more data to manually verify. So there's trade-offs with the question that you're trying to answer and how you post-process that data to get at that. And the different types of classifier software that you use for these different things, if you're just manually verifying your data, you just need to be able to generate spectrograms, which you can do in a free software like Audacity. Raven is also able to do that as well, and I'm sure there's others. If you're going to be classifying data, you really need a specialized software such as Kaleidoscope or Raven. And then to implement a machine learning model, most of those use Python, which is a free software. But again, you kind of need to know how to use Python before jumping into it here. So then lastly, once you've processed and gotten the data that you need from your audio files, you need somewhere to store it. And as I mentioned previously, this can get pretty large. And so it's generally you want to use hard drives for this because it can take up cloud storage very quickly. However, if you have a large cloud storage service, this would be a really good option. But I generally use hard drives for our project here. And then the other thing is that this audio data can be lost if you only have one copy of it. So it's always good to have a backup and make sure that you're storing this data in several different places just to guard against, anything going wrong or anything like that. So this is still a project that's in progress here. We're going to start heading out into the field here in a couple of weeks, which is really cool. And this is, just looking forward into future work, after this project. Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is going to be building a state monitoring program for these species. And there's just a couple things that I think would help further improve the way that we monitor and survey for these species. And the first of which is movement in home ranges, because this would give us a better idea of how far to space monitors and what kind of scales of inference you're looking at once you have that data. It would be really good to know how much cuckoos are moving around within the breeding season. And then also a better knowledge of cuckoo calls. And this is more specifically for the black-billed cuckoo, because they have similar calls to yellow-billed cuckoos, but there hasn't been a succinct vocal repertoire that people have built for, specifically defining the different call types. So that would be super useful to have and to use, as well as getting a better idea of cuckoo call rates and the different behavioral contexts in which these calls are given. For instance, the black-billed cuckoos, they're known to call during the night, and we still don't really know why. It's thought that it's calls that they're giving while they're flying to forage during the night, but yeah, there's still a lot of missing information on why they're calling, when they're calling, and what these calls are. And yeah, that's all I have for y'all today. I would love to hear questions or any thoughts on our project. And here's my email if you want to reach out to me after this. I'd be happy to talk more about this.